Well, welcome. I know you're a bit nervous to be on the podcast today, Tanveer, so I appreciate it. You were just saying to me before we started that if it had been anyone else asking, you would have said no. So I'm very grateful that you're here to have this conversation with me today.
Totally. Thank you for having me, Michelle.
I always like to start, Tanveer, by going backwards because education is something that we work in now. It's a field, it's an industry, it's a business to a large extent. It's also a social structure and a system and one of the main sources of empowerment that we also have as a species. But we've all been exposed to it. We've all gone through it in some way, shape, or form. So I always like to go back and think, ask people who join me first, what was your experience with education? Like when you were a kid, what did school look like for you? How did you feel going to school? Did it feel welcoming? Did it feel exciting? Or was it like, oh, I have to go to school?
I want to say that I grew up in a very rigid structure of education. So you went to school, you were taught a certain way. There wasn't too much experimentation of different ways of learning and stuff. And as a young child, I actually struggled learning in the classroom. I was one of those kids that was born at the end of the year, so I was always less mature than everybody else in the classroom, right? And I think it took a few years to kind of settle in. Elementary school was a little bit of a struggle. But then by the time I got to high school, I think I loved being there, not necessarily because I loved the content that I was, learning, but it was the social aspect. I think it was getting along, being around friends and stuff like that, that really, was really exciting for me at that age. And then I know like the last day of high school, and I was like, oh, I'm really going to miss this, that kind of thought that goes, I'm sure everyone goes through it. But when I moved to, so say, North America and began, education in the States, that's where I was in America. It was very different. And I felt like I was empowered to do things the way I wanted to do, the way I wanted to learn. And those opportunities, like I've always been invested kind of in like, if you give people the power to choose their path, they do better. Right. And so that to me, that freedom felt very different from what I was used to in my schooling experience, which was these are subjects you take and that's all you get. There wasn't choosing what you were interested in or anything like that. This is the structure and that's what you get to do, right?
And the American educational context you experienced in university, that was a post-secondary.
Yes, it was college. So it was college, yes, post-secondary.
And then where did you take your elementary and secondary school?
In Kenya.
In Kenya.
So I grew up in Kenya. We followed a British system, but just with the ability to be able to offer certain courses, there was a limited amount of courses that were offered, and you just took those. Everybody was doing the same thing.
Yeah, they were the ones deemed these are the appropriate courses. These are the
courses. You needed the sciences, and you needed math, and that was it, and maybe economics, right? That was all they could offer, and that's what everyone took, right?
It's very interesting to me because normally you get a lot of people who say that elementary school was actually where they enjoyed themselves the most because it was play. There was more freedom, to your point. There was this experimentation, less rigidity in elementary school. And then when you move up in typical North American context, you get into more rigidity in high school, much more rigor, expectations, testing systems, and things like that, which start to, for some people, diminish the experience slightly. But for you, it was the opposite. It was the opposite.
You found, and I think I think it's more so because, at that time, like you felt the difference, like everybody else was doing something and you couldn't keep up for whatever reason, right? So elementary was a little bit of a struggle, and the structure that I grew up in was very rigid. Like you were assigned stuff and you better come back with it. And if you did, there was a punishment, right? So that's just the kind of structure. But in high school too, that structure continued. However, I think I really enjoyed it because of the social aspects. I started to resonate with others in the class, was now suddenly as mature as the rest of them and could carry on conversations and have fun, right? So it became a different experience, but yeah.
And how do you feel those takeaways, like those things that we've experienced in our own educational environments, they are in us, they're learned experiences. And now working in learning architecture and instructional design and learning experience design, how do you feel things like the social element and the importance of connectivity between peers, and this element of freedom and autonomy that you talked about experiencing in the college system in America. How do you feel those two things have entered into your philosophy or methodology when it comes to designing educational experiences now?
For sure, right? I think it has had a huge impact in who I am as a person too, and obviously I bring my whole person when it comes to my work too. But just knowing that, sometimes the structure or the social environment has a huge impact on the person is, to me, I've always looked at, whenever I'm designing learning experiences now, I'm thinking of I'm thinking of the learner at the center of it, right? And thinking, how do I make this so that this learner is going to be successful no matter what the environment is? And maybe it's a little bit of everything, right? There needs to be some structure, but it also needs to have the social aspect. And it also needs to have all these different parts that will make that different people will resonate with and be successful in that environment. So for sure, I think it has had an impact of how I'm able to resonate and see how other learners come to it, right? And I think my own experiences make me think wider, right? Like, I'm always thinking of what's the best I could offer so that I cover, in aspects of universal design, thinking how do I cover every different kind of learner? Because the reality is every classroom is going to be filled with diverse learners, right?
This idea of structure versus autonomy, because, we are mammals, right? Like, there are many social experiments, psychological and behavioral and otherwise, that have articulated that we do feel a greater sense of freedom when there are boundaries that are set for us, that there are clear criteria, for example, in terms of what you might be looking for, or to some extent, loose boundaries. Because so you and I working in innovation, there are many things that we've experimented with. One of the things that I've experimented with is this idea of no deadlines. And just saying, you have a certain number of things that you have to do in the course experience and manage your time, see how it goes, complete them when it makes sense to you. And the first iteration of that prototype is not what the third or fourth iteration of that prototype looks like, because learners need boundaries and understanding of, right? So how do you think of that kind of nuance between structure and freedom, right? Structure and chaos?
And I think it's a balance, right? In every course, like it can't be all freedom and it can't be all structure. I think the balance really is up to the educator. I think they're at the center of it. And I always lean off of their experiences to kind of design what works best for them. But in any environment, I think some structure is important. You need some kind of boundaries. But allowing people flexibility within that is key to any experience, right? So it's always a trade-off. It's a balance, right? I'm going to do this that's going to be really flexible, but some other things are going to have some structure around it, right? So maybe if you were going to use a course example, right? We could say that if there's 4 assignments due, you have 2 weeks for this one, the deadline is shiftable by 2 weeks, something like that, right? That provides at least that much flexibility rather than saying everything, because if you say everything's due at the end, guess what? You're going to get everything at the
end. And then it's funny because you actually get the same, the research results show that instructors and TAs will do the same level of procrastination as well, that they'll, if it's a staggered submission process, TAs will actually wait until the very end and then grade them all at the very end, just the same way students will procrastinate. It's very interesting because it's human behavior to an extent, right? Another example that we've played with is that idea is, again, around assessment is, there is a final assignment. That assignment is worth 25% of your grade. Here are 3 different assignments you could choose from, right?
Totally.
Choose the one that makes the most sense to you. Potentially one's, a written, one's more visual, one's recorded, something of that nature.
Exactly.
But you mentioned an interesting, so you have said student-centered and teacher-centered. Both. And one of the things I find fascinating about the work that you do supporting instructors in the design process in a higher education environment where we do really highly focus on the student experience.
Yes.
How do we, again, I feel like the title of this episode is going to be something like straddling the, finding balance or figuring out where the middle is, because how do you be student-centered and instructor-centered, Tanveer.
Yeah. And it's a hard thing to do, but whenever I look at, I think one of my first few consultations that I have with any faculty member, I place myself in their space, right? And I'll say, look, I'm here to support you, and we're going to make this easy for you while we also think about your learner, right? And it is easy to do. I think it's not as difficult. I think the task seems daunting when we first tackle it, but there are little things that we can do, and just even alerting them that, look, if you give this flexibility, it means this for you. I think the way I'm positioned and the role is a key to that. And I always use the line, right? I'm here for you and for your student, right? And we need to balance both of those. What makes sense for you and what makes sense for your student. It is possible to do. I think when we're designing experiences and coming from a learning experience design, I think of everyone that's involved, right? So all my stakeholders, and a faculty member is one of my stakeholders, and the learner is the other stakeholder, right? So when I'm designing, I'm actually thinking of both of them. Even some of the work and the resources that we create, I think about how am I going to make this easy for my faculty member, because sometimes that's the learner that I'm targeting, right? So when I'm creating stuff, I'm like, I want to do this for the student, but how am I going to place this in a way that it's also easy for the faculty member, right? So I can bridge that gap, right? I always say that you're going to have the best experience when you're enjoying the experience and your students is enjoying the experience. But if you let your student have the best experience and you're struggling through it, right, then they sense it, right? And so it won't come across as a great learning experience the way if we would have thought about it in the beginning, where we thought about what is the faculty member's experience in this environment and then what's the learner's experience, right?
I could not agree more. And I want to just double click on that a bit and get a bit more specific. When it comes to considering the faculty member's experience, the instructor's experience, versus the student experience, we're considering different things. Like some are the same, but some are different. Like I would say one of the biggest ones for an instructor would be time. You said easy for them, right? What are some other things when you're thinking of the teacher's experience in these spaces, the experience of teaching? What are the things you're considering? We're considering, okay, it has to be efficient. We can't be asking so much of this instructor that they have to invest more time and energy than they would in another design, because this is what we come up against when it comes to innovation, right? If we're going to change something, if we're going to look at teaching and learning in a different way from a different perspective, then these are the considerations we have to make. Workload, right? Time, effort, energy, workload. What are the other, let's do faculty first. What are some other things for you're considering when it comes to, okay, this has to be a positive experience for the teacher as much as it does for the student?
So certainly ready to use resources, right? So I'll source stuff for them around how have other people done something, and show them some like success stories for them to say, okay, it's worth me delving into this area to innovate in this area because I'm going to see this, right? The other thing that I find is key is knowing that there's somebody that's going to be with them, to journey with them, I think is key to the success, right? I think whenever I start with a faculty member and even just taking apart their course and redesigning, I think they're worried that it's going to mean more work. But when they realize that they have somebody to work with them who they're going to be able to go to, the challenge just changes, right? And it's about having somebody else to work with. So I think that aspect of at least the success that I have seen in the last little while, it's the idea that I have someone to journey with who's going to point me to resources, show me things that I can use, help me with the parts that I don't necessarily have time to, I want all of them, all of our faculty members want to do the best. They want to give their students the best, but time tends to be the biggest challenge. How much can I invest in? So everybody just kind of goes to status quo, right? This is how much I can do now. But when they get to journey with someone like an instructional learning designer like myself, or someone in a similar role, opportunities change a lot because there's somebody else to it's almost like if I'm going to fail, there's going to be somebody else with me and I'm not going to be alone in it. And I think that keeps them grounded and they feel like, I can work with someone. right?
And it's a safer space, right? Like this idea of putting yourself out there, as we all know that cliched term, this idea of failing being a very risky endeavor especially in higher ed, when a lot of the instructor performance criteria is connected to student experiences, right? So if you try something new and a student doesn't like it, that can be very negatively impact one's professional career, right? Another avenue I've explored, which has worked, is this idea of highlighting their expertise as well, where, they most often in the higher education settings, instructors are hired as subject matter experts. They're not hired as instructors, right? And innovation, a lot of the times I feel like one of the main fears faculty members have around innovation is that they don't matter anymore, that their expertise isn't valuable, that it's Googleable. They can just search it. So how do you make those the small chunks of information and videos of their work, or an interactive PowerPoint or concept map? Like, how do we take their expertise and really highlight it and center it as core elements of the course as well? The other thing that you said, which I think is really important and bridges, again, the instructor and student considerations, like if we shift, what are we considering when we're thinking of what do the students want and how do we make a learning experience interesting and engaging for a student? Affective connection. So you use the word support, but I know you're a very kind, compassionate person as well. And this comes across as emotional connection and compassion and this kind of empathy that you have for people. So I feel like there has been, in the industrial age, a real disconnect between emotion and education. And ultimately, we are human beings that are hardwired to connect to one another and to feel safer in communities. So that idea of building those connections and having that affective component with instructors, would you say, is equally as important in terms of designing learning experiences that help students feel that?
Absolutely. I think it's key, right? And I don't think I gave it so much thought, but as I keep working in my role, I see it. It's the idea that, I did it subconsciously for the person that I am, right? So I generally just tend to be a feeler, right? Although a lot of my friends will say I'm a thinker, but I think I do, like, emotions are at the I empathize with how people are feeling, right, and how they're doing their work. And when I come to a faculty member, I think the key point of building my relationship is to empathize and understand where they're really coming from. If I was really honing in on whenever I start working and go to first few consults, it's all about building the relationship, understanding where they're coming from. So I think it's definitely key, and it leads to success. Like, knowing where the person is coming from leads to success. And that kind of actually takes us to that first part of your question, where how do you make sure that their expertise is at the center of what they're doing, right? And I think at least from my experience, a lot of the faculty members, they realize that that's their expertise, like their subject area is their expertise, and they're happy to work with someone who will help them shine that, right? Who will help them. I sometimes talk about your role more as a facilitator, because we're in the 21st century and information is everywhere. That's the reality, right? If a student doesn't understand something, they can Google it and I'll find it, essentially. And often enough, the role of the educator is changing in our day and age. The reality is, right? We talk about, like, you being more the facilitator and helping guide the knowledge, and that places them as still I'm the expert kind of thing, where I will bring knowledge to my students, but they can. There's also the freedom of go find it somewhere else. In fact, we encourage go find it somewhere else and bring it, and it becomes this space, that same community of learning, essentially, we want to create. I'm really key about creating that in a classroom, right? And that happens when really the teacher is in the role of a facilitator, I would say.
It's fascinating, because I want to touch on other elements with the student experience, but I need to pull on some threads you just mentioned, because when I think of what innovation means nowadays, I very much think of this changing role of the teacher, this idea that, in education more broadly, K to 12, and in other areas, like trades, like when I think of my early education, it was from my mother and my grandmother in the kitchen, watching them, working with them. They were teaching me how to cook, and my aunties teaching, watching them make rotis and figuring out, and getting covered in flour. And like those were learning experiences, and they were not subject matter experts. They were providing an experience. They were facilitating that experience. Touch this, try this, I'll answer that question, and so on.
Yeah.
But in higher education, we came up with this really strange model.
Yeah.
Like, I have all the information in my head.
Yeah, totally.
And my job is to put it in your head.
Yeah.
And this was labeled higher education. Like, forget the play and the experiential, but so now it's happening more, right? We're getting trends in experiential education. We're getting these ideas of authentic assessments, this idea of competency, skill-based education. But working so closely with faculty members, I do want to know how you feel this innovation is going from the staff perspective, because we're not changing our hiring policies.
Yeah.
Not changing our union agreements in terms of what it means to teach. Teaching is still a set of contact hours that instructors have with students, which are still often labeled as lectures.
Yeah.
So how do you see this innovation playing out on the ground? Like, you want to talk to them about being facilitators, but the system is being disrupted, wanting to see them be more facilitators, but the structures are supporting that. Yeah.
Yeah. To be honest, I do, over the last little while, I do see this shift. I think as much as, the pandemic is behind us, I think that there was something that happened there that that is never going to change the way education was the way before it was, right? And I think the idea of innovation and the idea of I can experiment just got released at that. It's almost like it came up at that time, and everybody was willing to try something else. So I do see that now, like all the faculty members that I work with now, I do see this willingness to almost innovate or try something new that I had not seen before. It was always like, this is the structure and this is what I can do, and that's it, right? And I think, I don't know what exactly, I don't know if I can if I can label it, but something happened during the pandemic, and that shift has allowed for more people to think, okay, I can innovate, and maybe there's a chance that I can be successful, and it can't go all wrong, right? And I think as far as our institution and our structure, there is one piece that has changed, and I've been at York University for a while, right? So I just there is one shift that I see, and it's this idea of the hiring of instructional designers, learning designers within the faculties to support faculty members, because we've always been so much about student experience, but we haven't done so much about supporting the faculty's journey, right? And I saw this big shift during the pandemic. There was tons of almost every faculty now has an ed developer, an instructional designer, or a learning designer, whatever that role is. But there is somebody that the faculty members can go work with to be able to do, and that you said it a few minutes ago, it's that safe space for them, right? And I think if we want to see innovation continue, I think this kind of environment, or the idea of having a place or somebody that you can innovate with and try things with is crucial to it, right?
You're right. Again, that idea of support, right? Like, you're not in it alone. This shift has happened. Experimentation is more open to you mentally and emotionally. You're feeling more ready for it. Here are staff that are here to help you in that process is a key element of sustainability. Another one I think is that we need to start recognizing, performance indicators in the higher education space cannot just be student evaluations. There needs to be, a championing of failure, experimentation, attempting things that are new, not having them go well, and having that be an essential component of growth in the teaching profession in these spaces. I want to talk about the labels you just said, the names, because to be honest, and I work in this space, Tanveer, sometimes I get very confused the difference with them. So could you shed any light for us and our audience, which I'm sure will appreciate your definitions of these terms? What is an educational developer? How are they different from an instructional designer? And why are, this LX, this kind of learning designer, learning experience designer. Is that kind of the top of the pyramid? Is that the tip of the sword? Like, how are these positions different? And if you were to suggest, what it takes to support instructors, is it a cornucopia of these staff members, or is there an interdisciplinary skill set that we can promote in one person?
Yeah. And you're right. Sometimes there's so much mishmash, and the lines between the roles are very gray, right? So I'll start with the ed developer. At least in my eyes, the ed developer is more, about pedagogy and what's the best pedagogy for this classroom, for this environment, and stuff like that. Focused on research and the larger picture, right? And instructional designer is really hands-on, right? So generally, ed developers will work with a group of faculty members and provide training in almost all universities. You'll see a teaching and learning support center, right? And the idea is they're at the curriculum level, they're at the program level. That's where the ed developer kind of supports, right? Instructional designer is more at the faculty level, so at your single course. Right? How do I support innovation in your particular course? So how do I help you change things in your course? I think a key, it's instructional designer, learning designer. I think we've kind of moved from instructional designer, because instructional designer was all about instruction and making the faculty, and now learning designer actually takes into consideration both the learner that you have, that you're putting together the instruction for, right? So my title is an instructional learning designer, and I think it fits well because it kind of bridges that gap. But that role is very hands-on and deals with course-specific issues with a particular faculty member, right? And I always say that if you want the ed developer to be successful, you got to start with the instructional designer at the course level, because even the faculty member, they're not ready to think at the program level unless they've got it figured out at their course level, right? And so even at the way we do things at our at Lassonde Education and Innovation Studio, right? We always start with the faculty member, and in their course, even though they might be the chair of a department and have far reach, but work begins at their course so that we can then spread it out across, right? The other role that you had asked me about, ed developer, you'd asked about the instructional and learning designer. There was
the learning experience designer, this LX term that you see kind of all over LinkedIn and job postings.
Yes. And I do have my certification in learning experience design. And really, learning experience design is about creating a human-centered experience, right? So the idea is that when a learner comes into the space, what are we going to remember? We're going to remember experiences. That's what we're not going to remember stuff that we were taught about, but experiences feed to your emotion, to how you're feeling, and that's what you're likely going to remember. So it's all about creating creating the learning as an experience, so that the learner will walk away from it remembering it. And again, even in learning experience design, you consider the entire experience. So you consider the faculty members' role in that space and how they're affecting it, essentially, and how the student, the learner, and their past experience is what they're bringing in and how it's going to affect that learning environment, right?
So would it be safe to say that all learning experience designers,
yes,
are instructional designers, but not all instructional designers are learning experience designers?
That would be accurate, actually, yes.
Right? Because someone who's gone through instructional design could have
it's a different
the ADDIE model of instructional design. They could be very focused on traditional methods. Yeah. So, and this is interesting because now I want to pull on that student thread, and then I'm going to zoom us out. We do this in two parts, Tanveer, so that we'll, I like to get like deep in the microcosm, and then we'll zoom out and get some big questions about these systems. Specifically, one of the ones I want to start with is how technology influences all these things we've been talking about. That's just part one of this exciting conversation, my friends. Click on part two and continue with us on this important journey we like to call the education revolution.